Now available as paperback and e-reader from the author of Spinsterella, A Strange and Unusual Romance, and Spellbound, A Darker Shade of Black comes from legendary Magazine. And you get the conclusion of the Spinsterella trilogy in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers today. Recently, Disney purchased all the entertainment assets of Rupert Murdoch's 20th Century Fox. And with this purchase of all of 20th Century Fox's assets, the Big Six media oligarchy is now a Big Five media oligarchy. And with less players on the table, that means less competition and less choice. Now, I look at this whole purchase of 20th Century Fox's assets by Disney as very bad for most Americans and most viewers of media all over the world. And the reason why it's bad is because when you combine this with Ajit Pai's recent decision to end net neutrality on the internet and the Telecommunications Bill of 1996, that allows corporate entities to control most of the media and what we see, not only on television, radio, and film, but also to what we see on the World Wide Web. And having this consolidation of power is not good for the viewer, because instead of us getting a fair and balanced view of media, we're getting only a view of media from a handful of people. And this consolidated view of the world is one that prevents us from getting the world from a clear and panoramic picture. And with Disney buying 20th Century Fox's assets, that takes another competitor off the table. And we've been seeing hundreds of thousands of competitors being taken off the table ever since the Telecommunications Bill of 1996 was passed by a Republican Congress and President Bill Clinton. Since that Telecommunications Bill of 1996 was passed, we've seen American media go from hundreds of thousands of production companies to just 6 major corporations. And with that, we've seen a complete decline in the number of television shows produced, the number of movies produced, and the number of radio shows and radio stations that are independent producers. And with that decline came a limited stream of content. And all we're getting these days at these Big Six companies, now Big Five companies, are the same old programs. We're getting the same superhero movies, the same children's movies, and no real variety. Now, when the Telecommunications Bill of 1996 was proposed and passed, we were told by the Republican Congress and Bill Clinton we were going to get more choice. And while we have a 500 channel universe, which evolved into a 1,000 channel universe with the TV going digital in 2009, there isn't much content on any of those channels except reruns. And when you go to pay for cable TV shows these days and cable channels, again, all you get are huge blocks of reruns of the same old 50 and 60-year-old television shows, and it's led to television stagnating creatively. The whole Telecommunications Bill of 96 led to a complete collapse of creativity in media, because what happens is when you don't have competition, people have no incentive to create. And because no one has any incentive to create, because there's no competition, that's the reason why we have nothing but superhero movies all the time, kids movies all the time with computer generated characters, and no real creativity, no real variety, nothing really original that defines this generation in terms of art and literature. And the Big Six people, they don't mind this, because all they're thinking about is making money. And most people who are comic fans, they're looking at this, again, from the same way these executives are, from a short-term perspective. And they're thinking about it from the perspective of, oh, Marvel Studios now will be able to make a Fantastic Four movie or an X-Men movie, because now they own the rights to the Fox properties. And because Disney owns the rights to the Fox properties, they can now adapt that Fantastic Four movie. That's a short-term view of things, and that's not really a good view to have, because I look at the bigger, more panoramic picture past a couple of little intellectual properties, and I see the long-term damage that will be done to American media, because I look at previous mergers like the AOL-Time Warner merger, and I see where all of this media consolidation is going to lead to some real serious damage to the American economy. Because in 2000, the internet giant America Online decided it was going to buy Time Warner. And after they bought Time Warner in a merger, both companies thought they were going to go on their merrily way. Unfortunately, America Online wound up with a huge decline in subscribers because internet technology had changed and evolved and broadband began to grow. And that's what led to the complete decline of AOL. And then Time Warner's executives who were struggling wound up being forced to push out the AOL executives, and that's what led to the end of really the decline of AOL. And AOL, a couple of years ago, was sold off to Verizon for far less than the company was worth because AOL at one time was so powerful that it could buy a conglomerated media giant like Time Warner. But once technology evolved, we saw the end of AOL, and Time Warner itself has never been the same because Time and Warner Brothers were forced to break up due to declines in profits due to their merger from 1989. They never really recovered from their merger in 89 or 88, and that company never was the same. And now we have Warner Brothers separating from Time, and Time has now been purchased by Meredith. So when I look at this media consolidation, what happens is all these companies, they become too big, too bloated, too heavy, and they can't carry their own weight. And what happens is they wind up creating products that do not sell to customers, and then they wind up declining, and then wind up, in some cases, even starting to be on the brink of collapse. Because I look at Warner Brothers, and they're a company that's on the brink of collapse because they've had movies like Justice League fail, and they gamble heavily on these big budget movies instead of smaller budget films and trying to build new audiences with customers of today. Now, when it comes down to this Disney merger, I see a disaster waiting to happen because with this Disney merger with Fox, where they're buying all these Fox assets, they're also taking on a lot of debt. And they are absorbing a lot of Fox's old debt. Now, I saw this happen with a company called Caldor here in New York. Now, Caldor was a retail store here in New York. They were here in about the late 80s, early 90s, and they decided to buy the assets of stores like Lamston's, and they bought some locations from the Alexander's Corporation, which ran the Alexander's retail stores. And they opened up stores in those old locations. And what happened to Caldor was Caldor bought a lot of properties and had a lot of assets, but what happened to Caldor was at the end of the day, they absorbed all those debts and they could not be able to pay those debts, and that's what led to the complete collapse of the whole Caldor Corporation in the mid 90s. And I see the same thing happening to your Disney because Disney has bought far too many assets over the last couple of years and it's absorbed a lot of debt from those assets. I mean, it just bought Marvel for $4 billion a couple of years ago. It bought Lucasfilm for a couple of $1 billion, and now it's buying Fox, and it's absorbing all these. It's got all these assets that they think are going to be wealth-building assets. However, those assets are starting to decline in value because when it comes down to entertainment, what was popular with people 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and 40 years ago isn't popular with audiences of today. And the whole back catalog that they have is starting to decline in value because they have too many assets on record, and all those assets are starting to decline in value because the audience for those assets, the audience that valued those assets, that audience is starting to shrink because the median age of many of the people who know Star Wars is 40 years old. The median age of a Marvel fan is over 40 years old. The median age for many of their Disney properties is starting to reach 40 years old. And they're not really creating any new properties. They're putting all their assets on old properties because many of the executives there are older men, and they think that these assets have the same value that they had many years ago. Now, another argument they have is that they were doing this to compete with Netflix, but how can you compete with Netflix with old, obsolete properties? All these properties are very old, so how can they compete with new properties that Netflix is creating? Netflix and Hulu and all these Amazon, they are creating fresh content. And that's one of the advantages that they have over the big six. Now, the Big Six would not be in this predicament if it had not lobbied so hard for that telecommunications bill of 1996, because that telecommunications bill of 1996 is literally like a ball and chain on the leg of big media. Because if they had left those old regulations alone, which said that only one person could own a newspaper, a television station, and a radio station in one market, what would have happened was we would have had that competition. And with that competition, we would have had people having the incentive to go out here and create new media. Now, there is a place where people are creating new media, and that's like the internet. And that's why Netflix is growing so exponentially. That's why Amazon's media is growing so exponentially. That's why Hulu's media is growing exponentially, because people have the incentive to go out here and create new media on platforms like YouTube, Vimeo, Dailymotion, and many other online platforms like BitChute and many others. However, your Ajit Pai, being the dummy that he is, decided he wanted to end net neutrality and go in with the oligarchs, not understanding that the oligarchs are the ones who have choked off all creativity, choked off all innovation, and choked off all imagination with their desperate attempt to try to maintain power. What's happening with the American media is these people don't understand that technology evolves, and when technology evolves, people's places where they go to get entertained are going to evolve. And there is no controlling that. And when you try to control it, all you're going to do is wind up stagnating the entire American economy, because the Telecommunications Bill of 1996 has destroyed television, it has destroyed radio, it has destroyed newspapers, because after that Telecommunications Bill of 96 led to all of these big corporations buying up all the newspapers, television stations, and radio stations, all of those assets wound up declining in value, and their ratings wound up declining, their newspaper sales wound up declining, and their radio ratings and sales wound up declining, all due to these purchases, because no one had an incentive to compete. And when you take away people's incentive to compete, what happens is people don't create fresh content. Now, when it comes down to the internet, the net neutrality removal, that's going to destroy people's incentive to create. And when people don't create, what's going to happen is these so-called broadband internet service providers, they're going to feel it later on. And how are they going to feel it? People are going to start cutting their internet in the exact same way they cut their cable. And the reason why they cut their cable is due to the lack of quality content. Content is king, and content drives most of the entertainment industry. Unfortunately, most of your entertainment moguls don't understand this point, that you can't keep creating the same repetitive, boring content and expect to have people continuing to buy it. Audiences grow older, audiences grow out of content, and audiences move on looking for something new. When I look at most of the executives who push things like the removal of net neutrality and the Telecommunications Bill of 1996 and this attempt for Disney to buy Fox, I see the same type of disconnected, out of touch executives who almost destroyed Hollywood back in the 1960s with their obsessive approach, where they continued to try to ram all these epic movies that were big budget, all these war movies that were big budget, all these musicals that were big budget, down the throat of an audience which was going through the Vietnam War. And all those people who were watching the Vietnam War, they had a different view of the world, a different perspective of the world, and a different experience of the world, and they wanted to see content that reflected their lives and their experiences. And I see all these old men still trying to shove their way of life down the world's throat. Unfortunately, the world has changed, and they don't want to adapt. And I believe the only way the world is really going to adapt is if these big six corporations go out of business, because these big six corporations, the oligarchy, doesn't understand that its approach to media is obsolete, and the content that they produce just doesn't appeal to anyone. Disney buying Fox is a sign that the media picture is changing, and that the executives at the top of that media picture have no vision of the world. They are desperate, and they're trying to hold on. And that can be seen reflected in the box office receipts for many of these movies, yes, these movies open up with big numbers, but the numbers that these movies make cost are just about the same, because the cost of one of these movies is in the $100 million price range, and many of these movies barely break even or barely pull a profit, just like their predecessors, the musical, the war movie, or the historical epic. Back then in the 60s, those movies started to wane in interest, and many studio executives were caught off guard, and they didn't know how to change course. It was only when people started letting independent producers come in that the Hollywood system was able to survive and go through the next 30 years that things were able to move on. But when I look at things today, I look at the picture of media, and when you see Disney buying Fox, it's not a positive thing. It's a sign of desperation, and it's a sign that American media is in serious trouble, because we have a handful of old people still trying to control a media picture that is changing, but you cannot control it, because if you try to take the internet and try to choke it off, what's going to happen is somebody's going to invent something new and different, and the internet will become just as obsolete as television, and people are going to watch what they want to watch. They're going to be entertained by what they want to be entertained, and what's going to happen is people are going to watch the content that they want to watch. There is no way you can ram your content and your views down people's throats, because people at the end of the day have the choice to whether watch it or not, or to read it or not, or to buy it or not, and it is up to the producer to produce content that appeals to the customer. And it looks like to me that the content producers want to tell the customer what they want, but the customer at the end of the day is always right. Disney buying Fox shows me that these people at the top have no connection to their customer, have no sense of how to serve their customer, and do not even have a direction for their company or their company's brand. With this whole big six media turning into the big five, I'm seeing a bigger picture where there's going to be an eventual collapse in this media oligarchy, and it's all going to be due to this failed telecommunications bill of 1996. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct independent publications, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.